all right, you think you might need a single audit, or shoot, do we need a single audit? How do we figure that out? So we're really just going to try to introduce you to what a single audit is and what to be thinking about. So what is a single audit? So this has to deal with specifically federal awards. This is an entity-wide audit of federal expenditures, and it all goes by federal expenditures, not federal receipts or federal revenues, federal expenditures. So if your organization in 1 year, that's your fiscal year. So if your calendar year, it's calendar year. If you're a June 30 year end, it's your June 30 year end. If in 1 year you spend more than 750,000 federal dollars in total, spend them, you have the expenditures based on your basis of accounting, and that's all federal sources total together. That's when you're required to have that single audit. I will stop here. There's a little asterisk. If you only hit that threshold because of ARPA funding, you may not need to have a single audit. There's a separate engagement that they're allowing in place of that. But it is only if you hit the single audit purely because of ARPA funding. If you need a single audit, even without the ARPA funding, then you have to get a single audit. So a little asterisk there, be thinking about that, ask that question of your auditor. A couple of things as far as how funding gets to you. Funding can be direct. That means that's coming from the federal government, Department of Defense, Department of Education, Department of whoever else it is, or it can be passed through, which a lot of times is what we see. So that's going to be passed through the state agency in most cases. So if you're a school district, money comes from the Department of Education. It goes to the Pennsylvania Department of Education and then is passed through to our school districts. Or it's coming from a certain agency in the federal government going to PADCED and then coming to our municipalities. That is pass-through funding. And really the testing or the single audit portion of this is compliance driven. So it's, did you spend the money how you're supposed to spend it, on what you're supposed to spend it, when you're supposed to spend it, and with who you're allowed to spend it with. The other piece that is unique here is internal controls are required to be tested. So with your normal financial audits, we have to assess your internal controls, but we are not required to test internal controls. A single audit is to test always compliance testing and internal control testing. So essentially, you want to make sure that we're having an understanding of what our funds are, so then we can go down the path of, okay, what do we need to do here to be prepared if a single audit is needed? Here's my other little asterisk for the day, and I think this is my biggest asterisk, is say you don't hit $750,000 in federal expenditures, awesome, we don't need a single audit. That doesn't mean that you don't need to follow compliance requirements and have related internal controls. If you spend 1 penny of federal dollars, you better be following the related requirements from that funding source and have the related internal controls, because everyone is supposed to follow it. It's just you don't have to have a single audit test. So I always like to put that out there because you don't get to completely wash your hands of thinking about these kind of things. The next couple of slides I'm going to go through quickly. These are just things for you to know, and you've got the information here that if you've got to dig in later, you can. Every year, a compliance supplement comes out from the federal government. This goes over all of the federal awarding agencies, talks about federal grants, and this is really where everything's included as far as what is required, what has to be tested, how it has to be tested, how internal controls are tested. This is what we use as the auditor to develop our testing. It's not a secret. It's a public document. It's out there for everyone. It has information specific to grants. And in some cases, there may not be specific information to a grant. So then there's general guidance that you have to follow if there's not something specific to your grant. In most cases, you're going to find that there is a part that is specific to that grant that you are spending money on. A couple other areas, again, I'm not going into details, just a taste of the things that you'll be hearing about, being asked about, and talking about with your auditor if you have a single audit. There is a consideration as to whether or not you would be a low-risk auditee. That means, have you had single audits in the past 2 years? What were the results of those audits? Were there any findings? Were they material? That determination is really based on how much testing needs to be done. So if you're a low-risk auditee, you only have to have a certain threshold of federal dollars tested. If you're not a low-risk auditee, that threshold increases. The other part of that then is determining the types of programs that are going to need to be tested. We call these major programs. Probably for almost everyone here, if you have federal dollars and you're spending them, it's going to be less than $25 million in a year. In that case, $750,000 is not only our threshold for saying we need to have a single audit, but it's also the threshold for what's considered a type A program or a type B program. Again, not going to get into the nitty-gritty details of these, but based on that dollar threshold, and then also a risk assessment of the programs you have, the federal grants, the federal funding sources that you're spending money through, that's how we have to determine what grants are tested. And then essentially we go through that process of testing them. Closing the loop here before we get into the meat of compliance requirements is how we do that testing. And I alluded to this. Essentially, the driver here a lot of times is that compliance testing. So there's different compliance requirements that Erin's going to go through for you. We're testing to make sure, again, how you're spending that money. Is it allowed? The other part of it then is the internal control tests. So we do have to, for every compliance requirement we test, also test the related internal controls. Those need to be documented. We need to test them. And essentially, we have to give a opinion on both the compliance piece and on the internal control piece, giving those results. I have an area here that talks about dual purpose testing. A lot of times we can pull the same sample to test compliance and test internal controls. Sometimes those sample sizes that we're required to do are different for both of those. So essentially, if one is 25 and one is 17, well, we're just going to pick 25 because we need to make sure that we cover both. Both of those tests technically need to stand on their own, but we can often use the same sample for when we're doing that testing. So that's kind of the brief introduction of what a single audit is. Erin's now going to spend some time going through the most popular or most required compliance requirements that will be tested.
Good morning, everyone. So as Krista alluded to, we definitely do not have the time to go through all compliance requirements. So what I'd like to do for you this morning is to just give you again a taste of those that we typically see most often in the programs that we provide single audits for. So what you have here is the compliance matrix, and it also says part 2 because if you go to the compliance supplement online, you will notice that it is broken down into parts. Part 2 is the compliance matrix, and then part 3 actually goes through more details for each of these compliance requirements. So there are 12 different reporting requirements. Not all of these compliance requirements, not all 12 of these are going to be applicable to every award that you have. And in fact, the common theme that you will see is that the federal awards are going to be limited to 6 compliance requirements. There are a few exceptions to that, but generally speaking, there will be no more than 6 compliance requirements applicable to any given major program. However, they can be from the 12 that you see here. So if you cannot read those, and I know that the slides are going to be small, you have activities allowed or unallowed, allowable costs, and cost principles. Those two are kind of interrelated, and we'll talk about those. Cash management, eligibility, equipment and real property management, matching, level of effort and earmarking, period of performance, procurement, suspension, and debarment, program income, reporting, subrecipient monitoring, and then we have sort of this special testing provisions, which is a catch-all for specific federal awards to kind of determine additional procedures that might be necessary or additional compliance requirements. These are not static. While many of them will remain within an individual federal award, many will remain the same year over year. We do see changes. So as Krista mentioned, the compliance supplement comes out on an annual basis, and we will see changes to a variety of federal awards where one compliance requirement that previously was Y, meaning yes, it is applicable, is now an N because maybe something else has come up within that award that is now more important for the federal agency, and so they have now moved an applicable compliance requirement. Again, it doesn't happen to every award every year. There is definitely some consistency, but it is not set in stone for year after year. Again, as I mentioned, we certainly don't have time to go through all 12. So I have picked 6 that we see most commonly that are pretty common throughout most federal awards. We do understand that with the variety of individuals in the room, many of you may not even have a single audit. Maybe some of you are on the threshold of potentially needing your first single audit. And so I do want to throw the caveat out there that while the 6 that we're going to discuss are the most common, there are 6 other ones that we are not going to be going into a lot of detail about. And even beyond that, as Krista mentioned, there are several awards that are not listed specifically in the compliance supplement. So while the supplement is extremely massive and has many, many, many federal awards out there with specific guidance on which compliance requirements are applicable and how auditors are to test those compliance requirements, those that are not in the supplement are not going to be in this matrix either. So the best advice that I can give to you is if you are receiving federal awards that are not specifically addressed in the compliance supplement, I would follow whether it's a grant or a loan, I would be reading through that agreement very thoroughly to determine what compliance requirements you have. And again, as Krista mentioned, we're also looking at the internal controls over that compliance. So not just adhering to the requirements within the award agreement, but also making sure that you have the right controls in place over each of those compliance pieces. So activities allowed or unallowed is just as it says. Are you spending the federal award on activities that are specifically allowed by the award? And are you ensuring that you are not spending funds on items that are expressly prohibited by the federal award? So as an example, the coronavirus state and local fiscal recovery funds is a big source of funding that's been coming to a lot of our municipalities. There are specific items listed in that program and in those grant awards that local governments and states may use those funds on. There are also specific items that are expressly prohibited. So when we come in or your auditors come in to do that testing, we are going to be looking at a sample of those expenditures, making sure that the nature of the expenditures were for allowable activities. Similarly, but slightly different, we have something called allowable cost and cost principles. So there are many items here that you have to make sure that you are factoring in. They have to be necessary and reasonable. You can't be just spending exorbitant costs on things that you wouldn't normally need. They have to be consistent with your policies and procedures that apply to non-federal funds as well. They have to have consistent treatment. So if you, for example, let's say typically all of your federal awards, you only have applied direct costs. You've said, we're only going to take direct expenditures that we're paying invoices for. We are not doing any indirect cost allocations across the board. If that is your policy, you have to maintain that across your federal awards. You can't kind of pick and choose and be inconsistent among that. An example here, I know we have some school districts here. So one example of an issue that we would run into potentially of allowable cost and cost principles, if you have federal funding from the U.S. Department of Education, for example, there are particular awards that may require you to have all of the expenditures for which you expect to spend their federal funding outlined in a budget that is submitted to the Department of Ed in advance of the grant year. If we are to come in or your auditors are to come in and test expenditures that have not been previously approved, that would be an example of a finding related to cost and cost principles. The other thing I want to point out, and this is across the board for all of these, is that they are adequately documented. So similar to, Krista's comment earlier, where we talked about having the right structure laid out, again, not just compliance, but the internal controls. Part of those internal controls are having policies in place and adequate documentation related to each of these. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here, but within the compliance supplement, this is just one little snip of a very large chart that goes through different organizations that could potentially be subject to single audit, states and local governments, higher education institutions, nonprofits, and it goes through various different types of costs as to whether they are considered allowed or unallowed, allowable with restrictions, unallowable with exceptions. So again, lots of further details in that compliance supplement. Cash management is interesting because what we find here is not so much, I shouldn't say we don't typically see compliance, but generally it's the lack of internal controls. So cash management there's 2 components to this. First, if you are receiving the funds in advance of spending the funds, you must minimize the time elapsing between the receipt of the federal funds and then when you ultimately make the payment for the eligible program costs. So the idea here is not to draw, $500,000 from the federal government, have it sit in a bank account collecting interest, albeit now probably not much, but collecting some sort of interest and trying to make money off of that. You want to minimize that amount of time. In fact, I have a note down here that generally if you do have interest earned in excess of 500, that actually must be remitted back to the agency, because again, they are not trying to help you, that you're not trying to actually make money off of this. So if you're getting those funds in advance, you want to make sure you're spending them timely. A lot of times we see organizations that are getting these funds on a reimbursement basis, which by default, you've obviously already spent the funds, so that's less of an issue. But the issue that we do run into even on these is the internal controls. So again, not just making sure that you have drawn cash and spent the money on an eligible activity and eligible costs, but if you have, for example, one person, again, I understand that there's going to be some small organizations, maybe you don't have a lot of staffing for this. But if you have one individual that is in charge of your grants and they are drawing the funds or requesting the draws from the federal government or the agency, there ideally should be a second person reviewing that request, making sure that you've requested the correct amount of money. If you have multiple federal or even federal and state awards, did you request the draw from the right program? And then again, just making sure that those funds are actually needed. Did you actually incur the expenses, or do you have the expenses to incur those costs to be able to pay them timely? Period of performance is probably the most straightforward one that we're going to talk about. This gets into, did you spend the funds in the time frame that you had to spend them for when the costs were incurred? And then did you subsequently make payments timely? So generally speaking, a non-federal entity may only charge allowable costs incurred during the approved budget period. Now that can also be kind of backdated. So as we've seen some awards come out with COVID and lots of new funding sources coming out, there are several cases where the money has come out and they've said, hey, you can go back to 2020 or 2021 and recoup some lost revenue, or if you incurred expenditures, so long as they were not already covered by another federal or state grant. We don't want to be double dipping. But the period of performance is making sure that you incur those costs within that eligible time frame. Subsequently, you want to make sure that you are making payment to the vendors within the time frame that is generally no later than 120 days. So while you might incur the cost, you have typically about 4 months to make those payments. So that's part of the period of performance as well. There are cases where the award or the agency may allow for an extension of that, but as a general rule of thumb, that is period of performance, making sure the costs were incurred within the correct time frame and also paid within an allowable time frame. Procurement, suspension, and debarment. We could probably spend 2 to 3 hours, if not more, on this specifically. And I don't want to belabor it other than to just point out a few key items that if you are getting federal awards that are where you know that procurement is going to be an applicable compliance requirement, the biggest issue I have seen, especially with organizations that generally have not received federal funding, is not having proper policies in place in advance of that funding, because they never had to worry. They never had to worry about federal government's regulations over procuring goods and services. And so unfortunately, I actually have had clients that we have had single audit findings because while they procured, they did everything that they were supposed to do according to the grant agreement, they didn't have a written policy that says, this is our procurement, these are our procedures, and these are the controls that we have over that. So first and foremost, making sure you have the policies in place. What do those policies include? You can see the items listed here. Again, I don't have the time to go into them in detail, but you want to make sure all of these are included. And again, the compliance supplement offers a really nice detail of things that you want to make sure you're including. We have this nice little procurement clause that I don't expect you to be able to read in your packet, but when we get the digital version sent out, you'll definitely be able to see. There are different thresholds depending on the dollar amounts of goods and services that you are procuring that the federal government has said this is what you need to do. Up to $10,000, we have this as a micro purchase. There are not a lot of requirements related to that. As long as you are considering the price to be reasonable, you do not need to solicit competitive quotations. like you do with larger dollar purchases. Up to 250,000 is a small purchase. Greater than 250,000, we have sealed bids or competitive proposals. Again, don't have the time to go into detail what all of these mean, but just know that these dollar thresholds do have different stipulations as to what you have to go through. Do you have to request sealed bids? Do you have to advertise publicly? Do you have to go through more rigorous processes in order to secure a vendor to procure goods and services that you otherwise would not be going through if you weren't using federal funds to make these purchases? The other piece to this is suspension and debarment. And this is another item that you need to have written in a policy because, again, I have unfortunately had to write findings for clients that followed all the compliance requirements and they did not contract with any businesses or vendors that had been suspended or debarred, but because it wasn't written in a policy, that still was an issue. So non-federal entities are prohibited from contracting with or making subawards to any vendors or contractors that are suspended or debarred from working on federal contracts. What that means is that not only are you responsible, for example, let's say you're doing a big construction project, not only are you responsible for ensuring that your GC has not been suspended or debarred, but that also applies to any subcontractors. Now, there are different ways that you can go about, again, listed on the slide here, how you can ensure that that they have not been suspended or debarred. But that is also, if procurement, suspension, and debarment is an applicable compliance requirement that is material to your award, that is also something that you need to make sure you are following. And then lastly, reporting. And there are two types of reporting that, again, could be spread across all federal awards. Financial reporting, which is pretty straightforward. There is a federal financial report that is pretty standard among several agencies. It's essentially a balance sheet and an income statement, might be tweaked a little bit, and it's going to be relative to that individual award and that program. But financial reporting, pretty similar to what you would be used to putting together for your organization. And then there's something called performance and special reporting. These can also have some quantitative pieces of data in it, similar to the financial reporting, but generally these are also going to be expanded to sometimes include qualitative reporting. So one example, going back again to the coronavirus state and local fiscal recovery funds, one of the sort of special reports that are required, in addition to the financial reports, it's something called a recovery plan performance report. And that's providing information on what projects that large recipients are undertaking with program funding and how they plan to ensure program outcomes are achieved. So that's kind of looking ahead a little more. Maybe you haven't spent the funding yet, and likely you haven't. But again, on a little bit more of a qualitative basis, those are some of the types of reporting requirements. Again, as have been the case with the rest of these requirements, it is going to be determined by the specific award. So you might have multiple grant awards where reporting, some might not have reporting as an applicable requirement and others do, but they're different types of reports. So again, you're going to go back either to the compliance supplement or your grant or loan agreement to make sure that you know exactly what is required. And lastly, those last two bullet points, the two keys with reporting are, one, making sure that the data you're reporting is accurate. We are going to be looking at those and in many cases tying them back to supporting documentation for key line items to make sure that you are reporting accurate information. And timely submission. Most times you will have a requirement to, for example, submit quarterly financials within 30 days of quarter end. Or if it's an annual report, sometimes you might have 90 or 120 days depending on the individual award. But making sure part of the compliance requirement is not just making sure you're reporting the right data, but making sure that it's submitted timely, because it's no use to the federal government if you're waiting 6, 8, 9 months after the end of the reporting period to provide what is essentially useless data at that point. So I know that was a lot of information crammed very, very quickly. At this time, Krista, I'm going to turn it back over to Krista. She is going to discuss best practices for tracking federal funds.
All right, thanks, Erin. So just a couple of things to be thinking about. These are your takeaways on how do we figure out if we have federal funds and what do we do. So a couple of ways on what questions to ask, what to be looking for. Your grant agreements. I know that they are not fun to read. It's a lot of legal stuff, but reviewing your grant agreements. And this includes everyone involved in the grant. So anyone who's really spending the funds should have access to be able to read the grant and be understanding of what it's for. Asset listing number. This used to be called a CFDA number, which I still find myself calling it. This is how the federal government identifies federal funding. It's a 5-digit number. The first 2 digits identify what department of the federal government it comes from. And then the 3 digits after the period are what grant it is. So if I have an example up here for school districts, 84 is the Department of Education, and then 010 is Title I. So if somewhere you see 84.010, we know it's Title I funding. So every federal grant is going to have that related asset listing number, or CFDA number, as a lot of people still are referring to it. That's going to be your guide to, all right, this is my number. I go to the compliance supplement, I look it up. That opens the door for telling you what is required and when. If you're receiving money from a pass-through, which is mostly going to be the case. So if you're not receiving money directly from the federal government, you're getting it from the state, they are required to let you know that they are passing through to you federal dollars, and essentially should have that in a grant agreement. But ask the question. If you get some kind of funding, you get notification from DCED or some other organization, and it's not specifically stated, ask the question. We have had this come up before, where essentially we've helped put some questions together saying, is this federal funding? Where's it coming from? So although they are required to let you know, it doesn't hurt to ask. The other thing to be understanding of is you could receive federal dollars based on 2 roles. So everything we've talked about here is as a subrecipient. So if you are getting money passed through to you as a subrecipient, it's considered federal expenditures, and you have to include it in that calculation towards $750,000. And that really means that, hey, we're passing federal funds on to you to use in your programs as you've maybe submitted a budget for or come up with programming. The other part of that is if you receive federal funds as a vendor or a contractor. This means someone is paying you with federal funds to do something for them. In this case, as opposed to having a grant agreement, you often have a contract. So this is one thing that we do want to make sure we understand, because if you're paid in federal dollars as a vendor or a contractor, that does not count towards the $750,000 threshold. So one thing, you as an organization, it's typically going to be one way or the other, but it could be both. You could receive federal funding in both capacities. So definitely ask that question. Tracking of federal funds, we talked about most of this. Again, it is federal expenditures in 1 year. $750,000, that's your triggering point for a single audit, and it's total federal awards, so all grants. Make sure you're keeping track of that, and it goes by your basis of accounting. So if you're accrual basis, modified cash basis. And again, as Erin alluded to, you could receive money in advance, like the ARPA funding came to us in advance and then we're spending it, or you could have grants that are reimbursement based. You have to spend the money first and then submit it for reimbursement. So having a good idea and tracking how that works when we're submitting for reimbursement is good to just kind of have all inclusive of all of those of all those funding sources, so you know what's federal and what's not. I did allude to in my first session this morning that if you have a single audit, there are additional items included in your financial reporting package. The SEFA, or Schedule of Expenditures of Federal Awards, is really the report that says here are all of the federal awards that we have. There's a bunch of items that are required to be on here, but really it's where did the money come from, the agency of the federal government, who passed it to us if there was a pass-through, so that would be the state agency, what that asset listing number is, so what is the grant, what's the grant name, how much did we receive, how much did we expend, and did we as an entity pass any on to another organization, meaning do we have subrecipients of our funds, because of then that kind of opens the door for additional requirements on us. We need to make sure anyone we give the money to, it's spent appropriately. And then wrapping up here, last slide, best practices, no double dipping. So we do need to make sure, whether it's PPP loans, whether it's other federal grants, state grants, etc., we cannot double dip. We need to make sure that we are tracking everything and keeping things separate. Documentation truly is the key here. So that's policies and procedures, making sure everyone is aware of what your policies and procedures are, assess them periodically, assess them for each grant, because it could change for each grant. And then really just work with your auditor, reach out. For some people, the single audit process is going to be completely brand new. Also, you might have a brand new program that's going to be large and tested that opens the door of a lot of different compliance requirements you may not have dealt with in the past. So again, these are just things to be thinking about, questions to be asking, but don't hesitate to reach out because obviously we're here to guide you through this. I think that's it. Thank you, everyone.